Chapter 4. What I read in the Black Book formed a fiendishly apt preparation for the news items and closer events which began to force themselves upon me in the spring of 1932. I can scarcely recall just when the increasingly frequent reports of police action against the odd and fantastical religious cults in the Orient and elsewhere commenced to impress me, but by May or June, I realized that there was, all over the world, a surprising and unwonted burst of activity on the part of bizarre, furtive, and esoteric mystical organizations ordinarily quiescent and seldom heard from. It is not likely that I would have connected these reports with either the hints of von Junst or the popular furore over the mummy and cylinder in the museum, but for certain significant syllables and persistent resemblances, sensationally dwelt upon by the press in the rites and speeches of the various secret celebrants brought to public attention. As it was, I could not help remarking with disquiet the frequent recurrence of a name, in various corrupt forms, which seemed to constitute a focal point of all the cult worship, and which was obviously regarded with a singular mixture of reverence and terror. Some of the forms quoted were Gatanta, Tanota, Than, Tha, Gatan, and Katanta, and it did not require the suggestions of my now numerous occultist correspondents to make me see in these variants a hideous and suggestive kinship to the monstrous name rendered by von Junst as Gatanothoa. There were other disquieting features too. Again and again the reports cited vague, awestruck references to a true scroll, something on which tremendous consequences seemed to hinge, and which was mentioned as being in the custody of a certain Nagob, whoever and whatever he might be. Likewise, there was an insistent repetition of a name which sounded like Tog, Tiok, Yog, Zob, or Yob, and which my more and more excited consciousness involuntarily linked with the name of the hapless heretic Teyog as given in the Black Book. This name was usually uttered in connection with such cryptical phrases as, "It is none other than he had looked upon its face, he knows all, though he can neither see nor feel. He has brought the memory down through the Aeons, the true scroll will release him. Nagob has the true scroll, he can tell where to find it." Something very queer was undoubtedly in the air, and I did not wonder when my occultist correspondents, as well as the sensational Sunday papers, began to connect the new abnormal stirrings with the legends of Mu on the one hand, and with the frightful mummy's recent exploitation on the other hand. The widespread articles in the first wave of press publicity, with their insistent linkage of the mummy, cylinder, and scroll with the tale in the Black Book, and their crazily fantastic speculations about the whole matter, might very well have roused the latent fanaticism in hundreds of those furtive groups of exotic devotees with which our complex world abounds. Nor did the papers cease adding fuel to the flames, for the stories on the cult stirrings were even wilder than the earlier series of yarns. As the summer drew on, attendants noticed a curious new element among the throngs of visitors, which, after a lull following the first burst of publicity, were again drawn to the museum by the second furore. More and more frequently there were persons of strange and exotic aspect, swarthy Asiatics, long-haired nondescripts, and bearded brown men who seemed unused to European clothes, who would invariably inquire for the Hall of Mummies, and would subsequently be found staring at the hideous Pacific specimen in a veritable ecstasy of fascination. Some quiet, sinister undercurrent in this flood of eccentric foreigners seemed to impress all the guards, and I myself was far from undisturbed. I could not help thinking of the prevailing cult stirrings among just such exotics as these, and the connection of those stirrings with myths all too close to the frightful mummy and its cylinder scroll. At times I was half tempted to withdraw the mummy from exhibition, especially when an attendant told me that he had several times glimpsed strangers making odd obeisances before it, and had overheard sing-song mutterings which sounded like chants or rituals addressed to it at hours when the visiting throngs were somewhat thinned. One of the guards acquired a queer, nervous hallucination about the petrified horror in the lone glass case, alleging that he could see from day to day certain vague, subtle, and infinitely slight changes in the frantic flexion of the bony claws and in the fear-crazed expression of the leathery face. He could not get rid of the loathsome idea that those horrible bulging eyes were about to pop suddenly open. It was early in September when the curious crowds had lessened and the Hall of Mummies was sometimes vacant, that the attempt to get at the mummy by cutting the glass of its case was made. The culprit, a swarthy Polynesian, was spied in time by a guard and was overpowered before any damage occurred. Upon investigation, the fellow turned out to be an Hawaiian notorious for his activity in certain underground religious cults and having a considerable police record in connection with abnormal and inhuman rites and sacrifices. Some of the papers found in his room were highly puzzling and disturbing, including many sheets covered with hieroglyphs closely resembling those on the scroll at the museum and in the Black Book of von Junst, but regarding these things he could not be prevailed upon to speak. Scarcely a week after this incident, another attempt to get at the mummy, this time by tampering with the lock of his case, resulted in a second arrest. The offender, a Singalese, had as long and unsavory a record of loathsome cult activities as the Hawaiian had possessed, and displayed a kindred unwillingness to talk to the police. What made this case doubly and darkly interesting was that a guard had noticed this man several times before, and had heard him addressing to the mummy a peculiar chant containing unmistakable repetitions of the word Tiog. As a result of this affair, I doubled the guards in the Hall of Mummies and ordered them never to leave the now notorious specimen out of sight, even for a moment. As may well be imagined, the press made much of these two incidents, reviewing its talk of primal and fabulous Mu, and claiming boldly that the hideous mummy was none other than the daring heretic Tiog, petrified by something he had seen in the pre-human citadel he had invaded and preserved intact through 175,000 years of our planet's turbulent history. That the strange devotees represented cults descended from Mu, and that they were worshipping the mummy, or perhaps even seeking to awaken it to life by spells and incantations, was emphasized and reiterated in the most sensational fashion. Writers exploited the insistence of the old legends that the brain of Gatanotoa's petrified victims remained conscious and unaffected, a point which served as a basis for the wildest and most improbable speculations. The mention of a true scroll also received due attention, it being the prevailing popular theory that Tiog's stolen charm against Gatanotoa was somewhere in existence and that cult members were trying to bring it into contact with Tiog himself for some purpose of their own. One result of this exploitation was that a third wave of gaping visitors began flooding the museum and staring at the hellish mummy which served as a nucleus for the whole strange and disturbing affair. It was among this wave of spectators, many of whom made repeated visits, that talk of the mummy's vaguely changing aspect first began to be widespread. I suppose, despite the disturbing notion of the nervous guard some months before, that the museum's personnel was too well used to the constant sight of odd shapes to pay close attention to details. In any case, it was the excited whispers of visitors which at length aroused the guards to the subtle mutation which was apparently in progress. Almost simultaneously, the press got hold of it, with blatant results which can well be imagined. Naturally, I gave the matter my most careful observation, and by the middle of October decided that a definite disintegration of the mummy was underway. Through some chemical or physical influence in the air, the half-stony, half-leathery fibers seemed to be gradually relaxing, causing distinct variations in the angles of the limbs and in certain details of the fear-twisted facial expression. After a half-century of perfect preservation, this was a highly disconcerting development, and I had the museum's taxidermist, Dr. Moore, go carefully over the gruesome object several times. He reported a general relaxation and softening, and gave the thing 2 or 3 astringent sprayings, but did not dare to attempt anything drastic, lest there be a sudden crumbling and accelerated decay. The effect of all this upon the gaping crowds was curious. Heretofore, each new sensation sprung by the press had brought fresh waves of staring and whispering visitors, but now, though the papers blathered endlessly about the mummy's changes, the public seemed to have acquired a definite sense of fear, which outranked even its morbid curiosity. People seemed to feel that a sinister aura hovered over the museum, and from a high peak, the attendance fell to a level distinctly below normal. This lessened attendance gave added prominence to the stream of freakish foreigners who continued to infest the place, and whose numbers seemed in no way diminished. On November 18th, a Peruvian of Indian blood suffered a strange hysterical or epileptic seizure in front of the mummy, afterward shrieking from his hospital cot, "It tried to open its eyes! Teog tried to open his eyes and stare at me!" I was by this time on the point of removing the object from exhibition, but permitted myself to be overruled at a meeting of our very conservative directors. However, I could see that the museum was beginning to acquire an unholy reputation in its austere and quiet neighborhood. After this incident, I gave instructions that no one be allowed to pause before the monstrous Pacific relic for more than a few minutes at a time. It was on November 24th, after the museum's 5 o'clock closing, that one of the guards noticed a minute opening of the mummy's eyes. The phenomenon was very slight, nothing but a thin crescent of cornea being visible in either eye, but it was nonetheless of the highest interest. Dr. Moore, having been summoned hastily, was about to study the exposed bits of eyeball with a magnifier when his handling of the mummy caused the leathery lids to fall tightly shut again. All gentle efforts to open them failed, and the taxidermist did not dare to apply drastic measures. When he notified me of all this by telephone, I felt a sense of mounting dread, hard to reconcile with the apparently simple event concerned. For a moment I could share the popular impression that some evil, amorphous blight from unplumbed deeps of time and space hung murkily and menacingly over the museum. 2 nights later, a sullen Filipino was trying to secrete himself in the museum at closing time. Arrested and taken to the station, he refused even to give his name and was detained as a suspicious person. Meanwhile, the strict surveillance of the mummy seemed to discourage the odd hordes of foreigners from haunting it. At least, the number of exotic visitors distinctly fell off after the enforcement of the move-along order. It was during the early morning hours of Thursday, December the 1st, that a terrible climax developed. At about 1 o'clock, horrible screams of mortal fright and agony were heard issuing from the museum, and a series of frantic telephone calls from neighbors brought to the scene quickly and simultaneously a squad of police and several museum officials, including myself. Some of the policemen surrounded the building, while others, with the officials, cautiously entered. In the main corridor we found the night watchman strangled to death, a bit of East Indian hemp still knotted around his neck, and realized that despite all precautions, some darkly evil intruder or intruders had gained access to the place. Now, however, a tomb-like silence enfolded everything, and we almost feared to advance upstairs to the fateful wing where we knew the core of the trouble must lurk. We felt a bit more steadied after flooding the building with light from the central switches in the corridor, and finally crept reluctantly up the curving staircase and through a lofty archway to the Hall of Mummies.